The gaslights of Chicago hissed and sputtered, casting a wavering, jaundiced glow on the rain-slicked cobblestones of 63rd and Wallace. It was the autumn of 1886, and the city was a roaring, belching leviathan of industry and opportunity, a magnet for the hopeful and the desperate alike. Into this maelstrom stepped a man who did not see the city for its promise, but for its perfect, sprawling anonymity. He was a man of many names, but the one he would settle on, the one that would echo through history with a chilling resonance, was Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. To the carpenters, plumbers, and glassworkers he was about to employ, he was simply Mr. H. Holmes, a prosperous and charming young doctor and entrepreneur, a man with a vision for a grand modern building that would be the wonder of the Englewood neighborhood. They had no way of knowing they were constructing a labyrinthine stage for a kind of murderous theatre the world had never seen, a building that would later be christened, with a shudder, the Murder Castle. Holmes's story does not begin in Chicago, but in the bucolic fields of New Hampshire, where he was born, Herman Webster Mudgett, in 1861. Even in his earliest years, there was a precocious strangeness about him. He was intelligent, frighteningly so, but his intelligence was coupled with a profound lack of empathy. Schoolmates later recalled a chilling incident where a young Holmes forced a friend to confront his deepest fear by shoving his face into a skeleton of a human being. The terror he witnessed in his friend's eyes did not evoke pity or remorse, but a cold, analytical fascination. It was his first experiment in human suffering. He married young to Clara Lovering, a union that produced a son, but the conventional life of a farmer or a shopkeeper was a prison to his grandiose and predatory nature. He found his escape in medicine, enrolling at the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery in Ann Arbor. The medical school provided him with more than just a profession. It provided him with a new language of power and a fresh playground for his dark proclivities. The dissecting rooms and morgues became his laboratories. He discovered a talent for fraud, teaming up with a classmate to steal cadavers. But this was no mere grave robbing for anatomical study. Holmes would disfigure the corpses, often by knocking out teeth or inflicting other injuries, then take out life insurance policies on the deceased individuals using aliases. He would then produce the mangled body, claim it was the victim of a terrible accident, and collect the insurance money. It was a perfect, if macabre, scheme that taught him two invaluable lessons. The system was gullible, and a human body was ultimately just a piece of flesh, a commodity to be exploited for profit. After graduating in 1884, he abandoned his wife and son, drifting through various towns, leaving a trail of swindles and suspicious fires in his wake, before finally arriving in Chicago, a city vast enough to contain his monstrous ambitions. He found work at a drugstore in Englewood, owned by a kindly, elderly widow named Mrs. Holton. He was a model employee, handsome, impeccably dressed, with mesmerizing blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. He was a gifted liar, his charm a weapon he wielded with precision. When Mrs. Holton's husband died, Holmes smoothly inserted himself as the indispensable support. Soon after, Mrs. Holton vanished. Holmes calmly informed inquiring customers that she had decided to retire to California to live with relatives. No one questioned it. He was just too believable. He took over the business, and with the profits, he began to plot his masterpiece. Next door to the drugstore was an empty lot. Holmes, using a complex web of lies and forged documents, secured the financing to build a massive 3-story building on the site. He called it the Castle. To the outside world, It was a mixed-use building with retail spaces on the first floor, including his own drugstore, and apartments and hotel rooms on the upper floors to accommodate visitors to the nearby 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. But the blueprints in Holmes's mind were far more sinister. He became his own general contractor, but he hired and fired a rapid succession of construction crews. No single group of workers ever saw the entire project through. This was by design. Holmes was creating a maze, and he didn't want any one person to understand its full layout. The finished building was a monstrosity of secret passages, dead-end hallways, and soundproof rooms. The walls were lined with asbestos, a fireproofing measure that also had the benefit of muffling sound. Doors opened not into other rooms, but onto brick walls. Staircases led to nowhere. But the most terrifying features were the ones dedicated solely to death. There were rooms sealed like vaults, some with peepholes, their walls painted black. Some were equipped with gas jets that Holmes could control from his own office on the second floor. He could flood a locked room with poisonous gas while watching his victims' final, agonizing moments. Other rooms were asphyxiation chambers, airtight and soundproofed. Then there were the chutes, false walls concealed metal-lined chutes that angled sharply down from the upper floor rooms, past the second floor, and directly into the basement. These were not for trash. They were for bodies. The basement of the castle was Holmes's abattoir, his private processing plant. Here, in the dank brick-lined space, he had constructed a massive walk-in vault. It was airtight, and he would later claim he used it to store sensitive documents, but its true purpose was almost certainly to suffocate anyone he lured inside. Next to it stood a gigantic cast-iron stove, not for heat, but for incineration. It was large enough to consume a human body. There was a lime pit for dissolving flesh, a dissecting table stained with dark, unidentifiable residues, and a variety of surgical tools, saws, and bone-cutting instruments. Holmes, the trained physician, was equipped to reduce a human being to their constituent parts. Flesh to ash, bones to splinters, and any remaining identifiable features to a sludge in the lime pit. His method was a well-rehearsed ritual of predation. The World's Fair was his hunting ground. The exposition drew hundreds of thousands of people to Chicago, many of them young, single women traveling alone, full of dreams and easy to disappear. Holmes, with his doctor's title and his air of prosperous gentility, was a master at identifying these vulnerable targets. He would offer them employment at his drugstore or a room in his hotel at a reasonable rate. He was a consummate seducer, using his charm and promises of love and marriage to lower their defenses. He would then convince them to sign over their life savings or take out life insurance policies with himself as the beneficiary. Once they were inside the castle, they were in his world. The locks on the doors were all controlled by him. A woman might retire to her room for the night, only to find the door had been secretly locked from the outside. Then the gas would begin to hiss, invisible and odorless, filling the room. Or perhaps she would be led to the vault in the basement under some pretext, to look at some special documents, to retrieve a stored item. The heavy door would slam shut, and the air would slowly, inexorably be consumed. For those he needed to dispatch more directly, he had his surgical tools. Death was a clinical, dispassionate affair for Holmes. It was a necessary step in a financial transaction. He did not work entirely alone. He needed accomplices, not as partners, but as tools, and he was a master at finding weak, manipulable people. The most significant of these was Benjamin Pitezel, a simple, alcoholic carpenter with a brutish face and a malleable will. Petel became Holmes's loyal, if dim, right-hand man. He was the one who did the dirty work Holmes preferred to delegate: the strong-arming, the disposing of remains, the handling of the more grisly aspects of the operation. Holmes also bigamously married multiple women during this time, including the beautiful and naive Myrta Belknap and the gentle, trusting Julia Connor, the wife of a jeweller who rented space in the castle. Julia and her young daughter Pearl would both vanish. Holmes later claimed Julia died during a botched abortion he performed on her, and that he dismembered her body in his basement. It was a pattern. Anyone who got too close, who questioned too much, or who simply outlived their usefulness, had a habit of disappearing. The summer of 1893 was the peak of his slaughter. The fair was in full swing, and the city was teeming with prey. We know the names of some of his victims, but the true number will never be known. Estimates range from a conservative 20 to over 200. There was Emmeline Sigrand, a beautiful, educated secretary with whom Holmes conducted a very public affair before she vanished. There were the Williams sisters, Gertie and Nellie, who came to Chicago for the fair and were never seen again. There was Minnie Williams herself, another of his wives, who signed over a valuable Texas property to him before she and her sister Anna disappeared into the castle's depths. The building was a living, breathing entity, and Holmes was its malevolent heart, feeding it a steady stream of lives. But all empires, even those built on bone and ash, eventually crumble. The end began with a financial crunch. Holmes was a prolific conman, and his schemes were finally catching up to him. He had accumulated massive debts through fraud, and was being pursued by creditors and law enforcement. He decided to leave Chicago, but he had one last grand scheme in mind. He convinced his hapless accomplice, Benjamin Pitezel, to participate in a massive insurance fraud. The plan was for Pitezel to fake his own death in a laboratory explosion in Philadelphia, after which Holmes would help Pitezel's wife collect the $10,000 policy. It was a larger-scale version of his old medical school scam, but Holmes had no intention of sharing the money. In Philadelphia, he did not stage a fake death. He murdered Pitezel using chloroform and then setting a fire to make the body difficult to identify. He then collected the insurance money by convincing the company that Pitezel was dead. This was bad enough, but what followed was an act of such profound, almost unimaginable cruelty that it would ultimately be his undoing. He took Pitezel's 3 children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, and their mother, Carrie, on a nightmarish journey across the American Midwest and into Canada. He told Carrie that her husband was alive and in hiding, and that they were going to meet him. All the while, he was writing letters to the insurance company and the police, attempting to frame Pitezel's alcoholic associates for the murder. His plan with the children was monstrous. He needed them out of the way. In Toronto, he rented a house and led sweet 15-year-old Alice and little Nellie into the basement. He had them stand in a large, empty trunk, perhaps telling them it was a game. Then, as they stood there, trusting him, he turned on the gas jet he had connected to the trunk and sealed the lid. He suffocated them both. He then dismembered their bodies and buried the pieces in the cellar floor. Little Howard he took to Indianapolis, where he checked into a boarding house and took the boy out one day, promising him candy. He was later seen leading the child into a dark alley. Howard Pitezel was never seen again. Holmes later confessed to killing the boy by burning his body in a stove, though the truth of his final moments remains obscured by his lies. It was this trail of grief and the persistence of the insurance company's investigator, Frank Geyer, that finally brought Holmes down. Geyer, a dogged Philadelphia detective, followed the tortuous path Holmes had taken with the Peitzel children. He uncovered the horror in Toronto, unearthing the pitiful remains of Alice and Nellie. The public, which had been following the case in the sensationalist yellow press, was horrified. Holmes was captured in Boston and brought to Philadelphia to stand trial for the murder of Benjamin Peitzel. The Chicago authorities, finally spurred into action, began to investigate the strange stories emerging from the castle in Englewood. What they found there defied description. The Chicago police, led by Detective Frank Geyer's counterparts, broke into the building at 63rd and Wallace. They navigated the labyrinth of false walls and hidden passages. In the basement, they found the walk-in vault, the giant stove, the dissecting table, and the lime pit. They found human bones, some charred, some showing tool marks, and tufts of hair. They found personal effects, clothing, jewellery, and letters that belonged to the missing women. The press descended upon the scene, and the legend of the murder castle was born. Newspapers across the country printed lurid, detailed accounts of the torture castle, and H. Holmes became a national icon of evil. Back in Philadelphia, Holmes's trial was a circus. He was charming, articulate, and utterly amoral. He gave long, rambling confessions that were filled with lies and contradictions. He claimed he had only killed 2 people. He claimed he was possessed by the devil. He wrote a memoir, Holmes' Own Story, which was a masterpiece of self-aggrandizement and deceit. He was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to death. In his final days, he seemed almost bored with the proceedings, more concerned with his legacy than with the lives he had destroyed. He requested that his coffin be filled with concrete and buried 10 feet deep, fearing grave robbers, or that his body would be used for scientific experiments. On May 7, 1896, he was hanged at Moyamensing Prison. His neck did not snap. He died slowly, of strangulation, over the course of 15 minutes. It was a final, drawn-out moment of suffering for a man who had delivered so much of it to others. The story, however, does not end at the gallows. The murder castle, that physical manifestation of his twisted psyche, became a place of macabre pilgrimage. It was heavily damaged by a fire of suspicious origin in 1895 and was finally demolished in 1938. The site is now a vacant lot, part of a post office parking lot, a bland, forgettable patch of asphalt that gives no hint of the horrors that once festered beneath. H. Holmes was more than just a serial killer. He was a symbol of the dark underbelly of the American dream, a man who used the tools of modernity, architecture, medicine, insurance, and industry, not to build but to destroy. He was a predator who understood that in the bustling, anonymous heart of a modern city, a man could build a private hell, and for a few bloody years feed it with the lives of the hopeful and the unsuspecting. His true legacy is the chilling realization that evil is not always a brutish, obvious thing. Sometimes it is a handsome, intelligent man with a soft voice and a convincing smile, a man who builds his nightmares not in shadowy forests, but right next door, behind a facade of progress and prosperity.